The 8th of May, 1945 dawned cold and gray over Berlin, and with it came the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. In basements, attics, and makeshift shelters across the shattered Reich, millions of young Germans awoke to a world turned upside down. Among them were the members of the Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, an organization that had once swelled to 8.8 million strong. These children and teenagers, who had been trained to worship their Führer and believe in the invincibility of the Third Reich, now faced a terrifying question. What would become of them? For 12 years, the Nazi regime had systematically indoctrinated Germany's youth. Beginning in 1933, when Adolf Hitler assumed power, the Hitlerjugend had transformed from a paramilitary youth organization into a compulsory state institution. By 1939, membership became mandatory for all children over the age of 10. Boys were trained in military drills, weapons handling, and Nazi ideology, while girls joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, learning domestic skills alongside racial theory and loyalty to the state. According to research documented in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, the organization had essentially replaced traditional education and family influence in shaping young German minds. The collapse came swiftly and brutally. In the final months of the war, these indoctrinated youths found themselves on the front lines. Boys as young as 12 were handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and sent to defend Berlin against Soviet forces. In the Battle of Berlin alone, thousands of Hitler Youth members fought and died in the rubble-strewn streets. 16-year-old Hans Scholl might have been among them had he not been executed 2 years earlier for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets, but countless others whose names history never recorded perished in those desperate final days. When the guns finally fell silent, the Allied powers faced an unprecedented challenge. What should be done with an entire generation of militarized, radicalized children? The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 established the framework for denazification, but implementing it proved extraordinarily complex. The Allies discovered that virtually every German teenager had been a member of the Hitler Youth. Should they all be punished? Could they be re-educated? These questions haunted occupation authorities as they surveyed the ruins of Nazi Germany. The immediate aftermath brought chaos and confusion. Many Hitler Youth members initially refused to accept defeat, clinging to propaganda promises of wonder weapons and last-minute victories. Some formed werewolf resistance cells, conducting guerrilla attacks against Allied forces. Others wandered the devastated landscape as refugees, separated from their families, traumatized by what they had witnessed and participated in. Still others simply tried to blend back into civilian life, hiding their brown shirts and removing their swastika armbands, hoping to escape notice in the general pandemonium. The Allied occupation zones, divided among American, British, French, and Soviet sectors, each approached the Hitler Youth problem differently. In the Soviet zone, the response was harsh and immediate. Thousands of former members were arrested and sent to internment camps. In the Western zones, authorities attempted a more nuanced approach, distinguishing between leaders and ordinary members, between true believers and those who had simply gone along. Yet this proved maddeningly difficult in practice. How could interrogators determine genuine remorse from calculated survival instinct in a traumatized 14-year-old? The summer of 1945 brought not liberation but interrogation. In towns and cities across occupied Germany, former Hitler Youth members lined up outside Allied administrative buildings, clutching the newly required Fragebogen, questionnaires that would determine their fate. These forms contained 131 questions probing every aspect of their involvement with Nazi organizations. For young Germans who had spent their formative years in compulsory Hitler Youth activities, answering honestly meant implicating themselves. Lying risked harsher punishment if discovered. Allied Control Council Directive No. 38, issued in October 1945, officially dissolved all Nazi organizations, including the Hitler Youth. The organization that had consumed the lives of millions of German children ceased to exist overnight. But erasing an institution from paper did not erase its influence from minds. Military governors across the occupation zones struggled with how to process the sheer volume of cases. In the American zone alone, authorities needed to review over 13 million Fragebogen, a bureaucratic mountain that threatened to paralyze reconstruction efforts. The denazification program established 5 categories for German citizens: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. Most Hitler Youth members fell into the follower category, provided they had not held leadership positions or committed specific crimes. This classification typically resulted in fines, temporary employment restrictions, or mandatory attendance at re-education programs rather than imprisonment. However, regional variations created inconsistencies that bred resentment. A former Hitler Youth Squad leader might face a prison sentence in the Soviet zone, while receiving only probation in the American zone for similar activities. The psychological impact of this sudden ideological reversal cannot be overstated. These young people had been taught that Germany's destiny was to rule Europe, that their Führer was infallible, and that sacrifice for the fatherland represented the highest virtue. Now they were told these beliefs constituted criminal thinking. Many experienced profound disorientation and identity crisis. Some clung desperately to Nazi ideology, meeting secretly to sing forbidden songs and reminisce about their lost world. Others felt betrayed by the adults who had led them into catastrophe, becoming cynical and distrustful of all authority. The education system became the primary battlefield for winning hearts and minds. Schools reopened slowly, hampered by destroyed buildings, missing teachers, and shortages of materials. Those teachers who returned faced the delicate task of instructing students who had been their ideological opponents. Former Hitler Youth members often knew more about weapons and military tactics than mathematics or literature. According to historical research referenced in the journal History of Education Quarterly, textbooks required complete revision to remove Nazi propaganda, creating delays that left many students without proper instructional materials throughout 1946 and 1947. Religious institutions also played a crucial role in rehabilitation efforts. The Catholic and Protestant churches, which had maintained complex and sometimes complicit relationships with the Nazi regime, now positioned themselves as moral authorities for reconstruction. Youth programs sponsored by churches offered alternatives to the disbanded Hitler Youth, though many teenagers remained skeptical. They had been taught that religion was weakness, a relic of an outdated world. Convincing them otherwise required patient, consistent engagement from clergy members who themselves were grappling with their own complicity and failures during the Nazi years. The material conditions of post-war Germany complicated everything. Starvation, homelessness, and the daily struggle for survival overshadowed ideological re-education for many families. Former Hitler Youth members scrounged for food in the rubble, participated in black market trading, and focused on immediate needs rather than abstract questions of guilt and responsibility. The harsh winter of 1946 through 1947, one of the coldest on record, killed thousands and pushed philosophical concerns even further from priority. The 1st of January 1949 marked a turning point as Germany's division crystallized into 2 separate states. In the Soviet-controlled East, the German Democratic Republic emerged, while in the West, the Federal Republic of Germany took shape. This political split created dramatically different futures for former Hitler Youth members, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain they found themselves. In East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party implemented its own aggressive denazification program that paradoxically both punished and recruited former Hitler Youth. The communist authorities recognized that these young people possessed organizational skills and discipline that could serve the new state. Those who publicly renounced their Nazi past and embraced socialism found opportunities in the Free German Youth, the Freie Deutsche Jugend, which deliberately mimicked some Hitler Youth structures while promoting communist ideology. The transition proved surprisingly smooth for some teenagers who had already learned to subordinate individual thought to collective purpose. The Free German Youth grew rapidly, claiming over 1 million members by 1950. Former Hitler Youth found familiar rhythms in the FDJ's emphasis on uniforms, group activities, and ideological instruction, though now they studied Marx rather than Mein Kampf. This continuity troubled some observers who noted that the organizational methods remained authoritarian, even as the political content changed. Young Germans who had been taught to report disloyal remarks to Hitler Youth leaders now reported counter-revolutionary statements to FDJ supervisors. The skills of surveillance and conformity transferred seamlessly across ideological boundaries. Meanwhile, in West Germany, a different approach emerged. The Federal Republic prioritized economic reconstruction and integration with Western Europe over continued extensive denazification. By 1950, most former Hitler Youth members had completed their review processes and returned to normal life. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed West Germany into an industrial powerhouse, created opportunities for young people to remake themselves through work and prosperity. The past was not forgotten, but neither was it constantly examined. A culture of silence developed, particularly within families, where veterans and former Nazi Party members avoided discussing the war years with their children. This generational silence would have profound consequences. Many former Hitler Youth members who came of age in the 1950s and 60s became parents themselves, and their reluctance to discuss their own experiences created a vacuum of understanding. Their children, the generation of 1968, would eventually rebel against this silence, demanding accountability and honest reckoning with Nazi crimes. But in the immediate post-war decades, pragmatism trumped introspection. The focus was on building, working, consuming, and moving forward without looking too carefully backward. Some former Hitler Youth members pursued remarkable transformations. Joachim Fest, who had been a member during the war, became one of Germany's most prominent historians of the Nazi period, publishing an acclaimed biography of Hitler in 1973. His journey from indoctrinated youth to critical scholar exemplified the possibility of genuine ideological evolution. Others, like Günter Grass, who concealed his service in the Waffen-SS until 2006, demonstrated how difficult acknowledging past involvement remained even decades later. Educational initiatives in West Germany attempted to inoculate the younger generation against totalitarian thinking. The Federal Agency for Civic Education, established in 1952, developed curricula emphasizing democratic values, human rights, and critical thinking. School trips to concentration camp memorials became standard, forcing students to confront the concrete consequences of the ideology their parents' generation had embraced. These programs represented a sincere effort to break the cycle of indoctrination, though their effectiveness varied widely depending on teachers, regions, and individual students. The treatment of former Hitler Youth in Austria deserves particular mention. After the war, Austria successfully promoted the narrative that it had been Germany's first victim rather than an enthusiastic participant in Nazi expansion. This narrative allowed Austrian former Hitler Youth members to avoid some of the scrutiny their German counterparts faced. The Austrian Hitler Youth had been absorbed into the German organization after the Anschluss in 1938, but post-war Austrian identity politics created space for minimizing individual and collective responsibility. The autumn of 1953 brought the first major public reckoning with Hitler Youth legacy when the Federal Republic passed the Federal Civil Service Law, the Bundesbeamtengesetz. This legislation addressed the controversial question of whether former Nazi organization members could serve in government positions. The law established that mere membership in the Hitler Youth did not automatically disqualify someone from civil service, recognizing the organization's compulsory nature for most participants. However, those who had held leadership positions or committed specific acts faced restrictions and additional scrutiny. This pragmatic approach reflected post-war Germany's difficult balancing act. The nation needed educated, experienced administrators to rebuild, yet those very individuals often had Nazi affiliations. The result was a compromise that later generations would criticize as too lenient. Thousands of former Hitler Youth leaders found positions in government ministries, police forces, and educational institutions. Some genuinely embraced democratic values. Others simply adapted their authoritarian instincts to new structures. The continuity of personnel from the Third Reich into the Federal Republic remained a source of controversy for decades. Individual stories reveal the complexity of post-war transitions. Alfred Anders, who had been a reluctant Hitler Youth member, became a prominent writer in the Group 47 literary movement, using fiction to explore questions of guilt, complicity, and moral choice. His novel Ephraim's Book, published in 1967, grappled with German-Jewish relations and the impossibility of fully escaping one's past. Through literature, former Hitler Youth members like Anders found ways to process experiences they could not easily discuss in everyday conversation. The treatment of female former members of the Bund Deutscher Mädel differed from that of their male counterparts. Girls who had learned domestic skills, racial hygiene, and devotion to motherhood in the BDM found these teachings suddenly worthless, or worse, in the post-war world. Yet the gender expectations of 1950s Germany actually aligned in some ways with the traditional roles the BDM had promoted, creating cognitive dissonance. Women who had been trained to see themselves as racial guardians and mothers of future soldiers now lived in a society that claimed to reject such thinking, while still expecting them to focus on home and family. Some former BDM members became active in women's organizations that promoted peace and international understanding. Anne-Marie Renger, who had joined the BDM as required in her youth, later became the first female president of the German Bundestag in 1972. Her political career with the Social Democratic Party represented the democratic integration of former Nazi youth organization members. However, many other women simply disappeared into private life, never discussing their BDM experiences even with their own daughters. The question of war crimes complicated the picture further. While most Hitler Youth members had simply participated in camping trips, ideological instruction, and military training, some had been involved in atrocities. In the final days of the war, Hitler Youth units participated in the execution of deserters, committed violence against forced laborers, and engaged in brutal combat actions. The Nuremberg trials established precedents for prosecuting war crimes, but the sheer scale of potential cases involving juveniles created practical and ethical dilemmas. According to documentation in the United States National Archives, military tribunals generally treated underage perpetrators more leniently than adults, but several hundred Hitler Youth leaders did face prosecution for specific criminal acts. The psychological toll manifested in various ways. Some former members experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the terminology and treatment options did not exist in the immediate post-war years. Nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming trusting relationships plagued many who had experienced combat or witnessed atrocities during adolescence. The combination of trauma and guilt created a volatile psychological mixture that the rudimentary mental health infrastructure of post-war Germany was ill-equipped to address. The 1st of September 1957 saw the Federal Republic celebrate its first decade of existence, and by this time, former Hitler Youth members had largely integrated into West German society. They worked as teachers, engineers, doctors, and civil servants. They married, had children, and participated in the reconstruction that was transforming their country into an economic powerhouse. Outwardly, they appeared to have moved beyond their past. Inwardly, many carried secrets and shame they could not articulate, creating what historians would later call the generation of silence. This silence was not merely personal but structural. The Adenauer era, named after Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who led West Germany from 1949 to 1963, prioritized stability and integration over confrontation with the past. Adenauer himself had opposed the Nazis and suffered persecution, but his government included numerous former Nazi Party members in positions of power. The Chancellor's philosophy held that binding up the nation's wounds required incorporating rather than excluding those who had served the Third Reich, provided they were not guilty of major crimes. This practical approach meant that former Hitler Youth leaders often worked alongside concentration camp survivors in the same government ministries. The economic miracle provided a convenient distraction. As West Germany rebuilt its cities and industries, material progress became a substitute for moral reckoning. Former Hitler Youth members could point to their hard work, their contributions to reconstruction, and their embrace of democratic institutions as evidence of transformation. The Marshall Plan funds that flowed into West Germany enabled this rapid recovery, creating prosperity that helped legitimize the new political order. Young people who had once drilled with rifles now operated machinery in factories producing consumer goods for export. In East Germany, the situation differed but shared similar elements of selective memory. The GDR presented itself as the anti-fascist German state, claiming to have made a complete break with the Nazi past. This narrative allowed former Hitler Youth members who embraced communism to position themselves as opponents of fascism, despite their previous involvement. The Socialist Unity Party argued that eliminating capitalism eliminated the roots of fascism, making extensive personal denazification unnecessary for those who accepted socialist transformation. This convenient theory enabled rapid rehabilitation of useful individuals while scapegoating West Germany as the repository of unrepentant Nazis. The divided memory cultures of East and West Germany created divergent narratives about what had happened and who bore responsibility. In the East, schoolchildren learned that fascism was the inevitable product of monopoly capitalism, and that ordinary Germans had been victims of ruling class manipulation. In the West, education gradually shifted toward acknowledging collective guilt and the complicity of ordinary citizens, though this process remained incomplete and controversial throughout the 1950s. Former Hitler Youth members navigated these competing narratives, often privately holding views at odds with public discourse. Religious institutions continued their complex role in post-war adjustment. Both Catholic and Protestant churches had maintained uncomfortable accommodations with the Nazi regime, with notable exceptions of individual resistance. After the war, churches positioned themselves as moral authorities guiding Reconstruction, but this authority was complicated by their own histories of compromise. Youth groups sponsored by churches offered spaces where former Hitler Youth members could explore ethical questions and religious frameworks. The Evangelical Church's statement of guilt, the Stuttgart Declaration of October 1945, acknowledged Christian complicity, but also created space for redemption and renewal. Cultural production began reflecting the Hitler Youth experience by the late 1950s. Films like The Bridge, released in 1959, depicted teenage soldiers in the war's final days with tragic sympathy, portraying them as victims of adult failures rather than perpetrators. This narrative allowed audiences, many of whom were former Hitler Youth members themselves, to view their younger selves with pity rather than condemnation. The film's success indicated a society beginning to process its trauma, though in ways that sometimes minimized individual agency and responsibility. The question of reparations and restitution rarely touched ordinary former Hitler Youth members directly. Those discussions focused on the Nazi state's crimes against Jews, Roma, homosexuals, disabled persons, and political opponents. Former Hitler Youth members were more likely to see themselves as among those who suffered from Allied bombing, expulsion from Eastern territories, and post-war hardship. This self-conception as victims competed uneasily with growing awareness of German perpetration of unprecedented crimes. The year 1968 erupted across West Germany, with student protests that shook the post-war consensus to its foundations. The generation born after the war, children of former Hitler Youth members, demanded answers their parents had refused to provide. These young protesters recognized that their teachers, judges, police chiefs, and government ministers included many who had enthusiastically served the Third Reich. The slogan, "Trust no one over 30, reflected suspicion of an entire generation that had failed to adequately confront its past. The 68 generation, as they became known, specifically targeted the Hitler Youth background of authority figures. They researched the war records of professors and published their findings in underground newspapers. They disrupted court proceedings when they discovered judges had served in Nazi people's courts. They questioned how their parents could have believed Nazi propaganda, not yet understanding that they themselves were susceptible to their own forms of ideological certainty. The generational conflict was as much about memory and honesty as about contemporary politics. Former Hitler Youth members responded to this challenge in various ways. Some maintained defensive silence, insisting they had only done what was required and had no choice. Others experienced the protests as a liberating catalyst, finally speaking openly about experiences they had suppressed for decades. A few became actively involved in educational efforts to warn younger generations about the dangers of totalitarian thinking. The diversity of responses reflected the diversity of original experiences and subsequent paths through the post-war years. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem from April to December 1961 had already begun shifting the conversation. Adolf Eichmann, captured by Israeli agents in Argentina, faced prosecution for his central role in the Holocaust. The trial was broadcast internationally, forcing Germans to confront detailed evidence of systematic atrocities. For former Hitler Youth members, many of whom claimed ignorance of the camps, the trial presented undeniable documentation of what their government had done. Some genuinely learned of the Holocaust's full scale for the first time. Others could no longer maintain comfortable denial. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which began in December 1963 and continued through August 1965, brought Holocaust crimes into German courtrooms. 22 defendants faced charges related to murders at Auschwitz concentration camp. The proceedings received extensive media coverage, ensuring that ordinary Germans, including former Hitler Youth members, heard testimony about gas chambers, selections, and industrialized murder. These trials represented a significant shift from the 1950s relative silence about Nazi crimes. They forced a reckoning that the parents' generation had tried to avoid. Educational reform became a major demand of the protest generation. They insisted that schools teach honestly about the Nazi period, including the role of organizations like the Hitler Youth in preparing Germans for war and genocide. New curricula developed in the late 1960s and early 1970s incorporated survivor testimony, primary documents from the Nazi era, and analytical frameworks for understanding how democratic societies could collapse into dictatorship. Former Hitler Youth members who had become teachers faced the challenge of instructing students about organizations they themselves had belonged to. The emotional cost of confrontation took various forms. Some families fractured as children accused parents of complicity, and parents defended themselves as powerless victims of circumstances. Other families found ways to discuss the past honestly, creating understanding across generations. Therapy and psychological counseling began addressing war trauma more systematically, as mental health professionals recognized the long-term effects of adolescent militarization and ideological indoctrination. The work of psychiatrists like Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich, whose book The Inability to Mourn was published in 1967, provided frameworks for understanding Germany's collective psychological defense mechanisms. By the early 1970s, German society had changed dramatically from the silence of the 1950s. Former Hitler Youth members lived in a culture that expected them to acknowledge, explain, and perhaps atone for their past involvement. This shift created space for more honest conversation, but also new forms of social pressure and judgment. The question of how to evaluate millions of individual cases, each with unique circumstances, remained unresolved. Simple categories like perpetrator and victim proved inadequate to capture the complexity of young people indoctrinated into participating in a criminal regime. The 10th of November, 1978 marked the 40th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass when Nazi forces and civilians attacked Jews throughout Germany. By this anniversary, former Hitler Youth members had reached middle age, and many found themselves reflecting more deeply on their youth experiences. The passage of time created psychological distance that made honest examination more possible, though still painful. Television documentaries, museum exhibitions, and educational programs about the Nazi era proliferated, making avoidance increasingly difficult. The 1980s brought a wave of memoir literature as former Hitler Youth members began publishing accounts of their experiences. These memoirs varied widely in tone and content. Some, like Alphonse Heck's A Child of Hitler, published in 1985, offered stark accounts of indoctrination and complicity. Heck, who had been a Hitler Youth leader, described his fanatical belief in Nazi ideology and his gradual, difficult process of ideological deconversion. His willingness to acknowledge his own enthusiasm for Nazism, rather than claiming passive victimhood, represented an important shift in how some former members confronted their past. Other memoirs took a more defensive tone, emphasizing the compulsory nature of membership and minimizing individual agency. These accounts portrayed authors as innocent children swept up in forces beyond their control. While this narrative contained truth, it also served to absolve individuals of responsibility for their actions and beliefs. The debate over how to evaluate adolescent participation in criminal regimes remained contentious, with no easy resolution. Should a 16-year-old Hitler Youth member who reported a neighbor for defeatist remarks be held accountable decades later? Legal and moral perspectives diverged. The American television miniseries Holocaust, broadcast in West Germany in January 1979, reached an enormous audience and sparked national conversation. Over 20 million Germans watched the four-part dramatization of a Jewish family's destruction. The program succeeded where decades of documentary education had struggled, making the Holocaust emotionally immediate for many viewers. Former Hitler Youth members watched alongside their children and grandchildren, often discussing their own experiences for the first time. The program generated over 30,000 phone calls to television stations and prompted intense family conversations across the country. Historical scholarship on the Hitler Youth deepened during this period. Michael Cater's comprehensive study and other academic works examined the organization's structure, ideology, and impact with analytical rigor. These scholarly treatments moved beyond simple condemnation to analyze how the Hitler Youth functioned as a totalitarian institution, how young people experienced membership, and what long-term psychological effects it created. According to research published in the Journal of Contemporary History during the 1980s, the Hitler Youth represented one of history's most successful examples of mass indoctrination, raising troubling questions about human susceptibility to authoritarian appeals. The reunification of Germany in October 1990 created new complications and opportunities. Former Hitler Youth members from East and West Germany, who had lived under different political systems for 45 years, suddenly shared a common state again. Their divergent post-war experiences meant they had processed their Hitler Youth past differently. Eastern former members had lived under another dictatorship, which shaped their understanding of their youth experiences. Western former members had lived in a democracy that increasingly demanded accountability. Bringing these perspectives together required negotiation and compromise. As former Hitler Youth members entered their 60s and 70s, mortality began claiming their generation. The urgency of historical documentation increased as witnesses aged. Oral history projects proliferated, recording testimonies while possible. The Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimony at Yale University and similar institutions collected accounts not only from victims, but also from perpetrators and bystanders, including former Hitler Youth members. These testimonies would become invaluable resources for future historians and educators trying to understand how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary crimes. The question of forgiveness and reconciliation emerged more prominently as the generation aged. Some Holocaust survivors engaged in dialogue with former Hitler Youth members, seeking to understand how their persecutors had been shaped. These encounters were emotionally fraught but sometimes productive, demonstrating that human connection could persist across even the deepest moral chasms. Other survivors refused any engagement, viewing it as inappropriate or impossible. Both responses were valid, reflecting the profound harm done and the limits of reconciliation. The 5th of May, 2005 marked the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and commemorations across Germany featured the final testimonies of the war generation. Former Hitler Youth members, now in their 70s and 80s, participated in educational programs with a sense of urgency. They recognized they were among the last living witnesses to the Nazi period, and many felt obligated to share their experiences with younger generations before time ran out. These elderly Germans visited schools, spoke at memorial sites, and contributed to documentary projects, offering complicated first-person accounts that resisted simple categorization. The evolution of individual perspectives over 6 decades proved remarkable. People who had been fanatical believers at 15 sometimes became the most eloquent critics of totalitarian thinking at 75. Others never fully abandoned certain Nazi attitudes, maintaining beliefs about German victimhood or minimizing the Holocaust even in old age. The diversity of trajectories demonstrated that humans possess capacity for both transformation and stubbornness, for both growth and stagnation. No single narrative could encompass the millions of individual stories. Organizations dedicated to Holocaust education and democratic values invited former Hitler Youth members to participate in warning programs. The Anne Frank House in Amsterdam and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem featured testimonies from perpetrators and bystanders alongside survivor accounts, presenting multifaceted historical narratives. Some former Hitler Youth members proved remarkably effective educators precisely because they could speak authentically about seduction by totalitarian ideology. They warned students, "I was your age, I considered myself intelligent, and I believed terrible things. Do not assume you are immune to propaganda." The psychology of aging brought new dimensions to memory and responsibility. Cognitive research on elderly testimony raised questions about reliability and reconstruction. Did these aged witnesses accurately remember events from 60 years earlier, or had their memories been shaped by decades of subsequent experience and narrative construction? Historians learned to approach such testimonies with sophisticated source criticism, recognizing their value while acknowledging their limitations. The testimonies revealed as much about how people processed their past over time as about the actual events of the 1940s. Germany's memorial culture matured significantly in the 21st century. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe opened in Berlin in May 2005, providing a central space for commemoration and reflection. Former Hitler Youth members visited the memorial alongside other Germans, each person bringing their own complicated relationship to the history it marked. The memorial's abstract design, 2,700 concrete slabs arranged in a grid pattern, allowed for personal interpretation rather than imposing a single narrative. This openness accommodated the complex feelings of a society still working through its past. Legal questions persisted even into the 21st century. While most former Hitler Youth members would never face prosecution due to their young age during the Nazi period, the trials of elderly Nazi criminals continued. Each trial reopened debates about justice, punishment, and the possibility of atonement. The conviction of John Demjanjuk in 2011 for assisting in murders at Sobibor concentration camp, when he was 91 years old, demonstrated Germany's commitment to prosecuting Holocaust crimes regardless of time elapsed. These cases forced former Hitler Youth members to consider what would constitute justice for their own actions. The digital age brought new challenges and opportunities for historical memory. Websites, databases, and digital archives made information about the Hitler Youth more accessible than ever. Younger Germans could research the Nazi pasts of their own family members with relative ease. This transparency sometimes created family conflicts when grandchildren discovered information their grandparents had concealed. Other times it facilitated difficult but necessary conversations. Social media enabled Holocaust survivors and former Hitler Youth members to share their stories with global audiences, though it also provided platforms for Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis. As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, the living witnesses became increasingly rare. Each death reduced the number of people who could provide first-person accounts of what had happened and why. This created a sense of historical closure approaching, a transition from living memory to documented history. Museums and educational institutions intensified efforts to preserve testimonies in video, audio, and text before the opportunity vanished. The race against time added urgency to historical documentation efforts worldwide. The 1st of September, 2016 saw German schools incorporate new digital teaching tools about the Nazi period, and these programs relied heavily on archived testimonies from former Hitler Youth members. The educational approach had evolved dramatically since the immediate post-war years. Rather than simply condemning the Hitler Youth as evil or dismissing them as victims, contemporary pedagogy explored the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled mass indoctrination. Students examined propaganda techniques, analyzed peer pressure dynamics, and considered how ordinary human traits like desire for belonging and purpose could be exploited by authoritarian movements. The final testimonies of former Hitler Youth members provided raw material for this sophisticated educational approach. Video archives captured not just their words, but their emotional responses, the pauses and hesitations, the moments when memory overwhelmed speech. These visual records conveyed the lasting impact of youthful experiences in ways that written accounts could not. Educators found that students responded powerfully to seeing elderly individuals wrestle with their complicated pasts, recognizing their humanity while still understanding the gravity of what they had participated in. Research into contemporary youth radicalization drew explicit parallels with Hitler Youth indoctrination. Scholars studying terrorist recruitment, gang involvement, and extremist movements identified similar patterns. Exploitation of adolescent identity formation, creation of exclusive in-groups, provision of meaning and purpose, and gradual normalization of violence. These parallels made the Hitler Youth experience relevant beyond historical interest, offering insights into preventing radicalization in the present. Former members who participated in de-radicalization programs brought hard-won wisdom about how people enter and exit extremist belief systems. The question of collective memory versus individual experience remained tension-filled. Official German memory culture emphasized perpetrator responsibility and victim commemoration, but individual former Hitler Youth members often held more complicated personal narratives. They remembered friendships formed in youth groups, the excitement of camping trips, the sense of purpose in challenging times. These positive memories coexisted uneasily with knowledge of what the organization represented and facilitated. Reconciling personal experience with historical judgment proved psychologically demanding for many. Comparative historical analysis placed the Hitler Youth in broader context. The Soviet Young Pioneers, Chinese Red Guards, and other totalitarian youth organizations demonstrated that Germany's experience was not unique. Totalitarian regimes consistently targeted youth for indoctrination because young people were psychologically malleable and could be mobilized for radical purposes. This comparative framework helped Germans understand their history as part of larger patterns, while not minimizing the specific horrors of the Nazi regime. It also warned that similar dynamics could emerge anywhere given certain conditions. The ethical questions surrounding the Hitler Youth persisted into the 21st century. How should societies balance accountability with recognition of diminished capacity in minors? At what age does participation in a criminal regime become morally culpable? When does following orders excuse action? And when does it compound guilt? These questions had practical importance beyond historical judgment, as they informed contemporary debates about child soldiers, juvenile justice, and moral education. The Hitler Youth case study offered no easy answers, but provided rich material for ethical reflection. As Germany's population aged and diversified through immigration, the nature of engagement with Nazi history shifted. For immigrants and their children, the history belonged to their adopted country, but not to their own families. This created different emotional relationships to the past. Meanwhile, Germans whose grandparents had been victims or resistors rather than perpetrators or bystanders possessed different family narratives. The diversification of memory required more inclusive approaches to historical education that could accommodate multiple relationships to the past. The final living former Hitler Youth members, now in their 90s, offered parting reflections that emphasized the fragility of democracy and the importance of critical thinking. They warned that the conditions that enabled Nazi rise could recur: economic crisis, social division, scapegoating of minorities, authoritarian appeals to order, and national greatness. These warnings carried special authority because they came from individuals who had experienced the consequences of democratic collapse. Whether younger generations would heed these warnings remained an open question. The 27th of January 2025 marked 80 years since Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz concentration camp, and Holocaust Memorial Day ceremonies across Germany featured among the final public appearances of living former Hitler Youth members. These individuals, now in their mid to late 90s, represented the last direct link to the Nazi period. Their presence at memorial events created powerful symbolic moments as they stood alongside Holocaust survivors of similar age. Two groups whose lives had been shaped by the same historical catastrophe, but from vastly different positions within it. The coronavirus pandemic of 2020 through 2023 had accelerated the passing of the war generation. Social distancing requirements meant many elderly former Hitler Youth members died without the opportunity for final testimonies or reconciliatory conversations they might have wished for. Digital technology partially compensated, enabling some remote interviews and virtual educational programs. Yet the physical co-presence that made certain encounters emotionally powerful was lost. Historical documentation continued under difficult circumstances, but the pandemic marked the beginning of the end of the living witness era. Contemporary political developments lent new urgency to the lessons former Hitler Youth members wished to convey. The rise of far-right movements across Europe and North America, increasing polarization, and erosion of democratic norms caused alarm among those who had witnessed these patterns before. Elderly former members participated in campaigns against contemporary right-wing extremism, lending their moral authority to warnings about where such movements could lead. Their involvement sometimes proved controversial, as critics questioned whether former perpetrators should position themselves as moral authorities. Yet their direct experience gave their warnings distinctive weight. The documented testimonies of former Hitler Youth members now form a substantial historical archive. Thousands of hours of video interviews, millions of pages of memoirs and documents, and countless oral histories preserve the voices of this generation. According to materials housed in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, these archives will serve researchers, educators, and the general public for generations to come. They provide unprecedented insight into how mass indoctrination functioned, how ordinary people became complicit in atrocities, and how individuals subsequently processed their participation. The question of forgiveness acquired new dimensions as the generation reached its final years. Some former members sought formal reconciliation with Jewish communities or Holocaust survivors. These efforts varied in their reception. Some survivors embraced reconciliation as healing. Others maintained that certain actions could not and should not be forgiven. The diversity of responses reflected the fundamental truth that each individual must navigate questions of guilt, responsibility, and forgiveness according to their own moral understanding. No collective resolution could satisfy everyone. Germany's educational system now treats the Hitler Youth as a central case study in civics and history courses. Students analyze the organization's structure, examine propaganda materials, watch testimony from former members, and discuss how similar dynamics manifest today. This educational approach represents the culmination of decades of pedagogical development. It avoids both the moralistic condemnation that prevents understanding and the relativistic sympathy that minimizes harm. Instead, it encourages critical analysis and personal reflection on how individuals and societies can resist authoritarian manipulation. The final autobiographical accounts from former members appeared in the early 2020s. These late-life memoirs often displayed greater honesty than earlier accounts, perhaps because authors felt they had little left to lose. They acknowledged enthusiasm for Nazi ideology they had previously minimized, described violent actions they had rationalized, and explored the psychological mechanisms that had enabled their participation. This final wave of testimony enriched historical understanding, providing data points from individuals who had spent 75 years processing their experiences. The physical sites associated with the Hitler Youth acquired new significance as memorial sites. Former training grounds, meeting halls, and headquarters became museums and educational centers. These spaces allowed contemporary visitors to literally walk where Hitler Youth members once assembled, creating visceral connections to history. Audio guides featured testimony from former members describing their experiences in those exact locations. The physical environment supplemented archival and testimonial sources, providing another layer of historical understanding. As the 2020s progressed, the reality became undeniable. Soon there would be no living former Hitler Youth members. The transition from living memory to historical memory represented a significant threshold. Future generations would know the Nazi period only through documents, artifacts, and recorded testimonies, without the possibility of direct conversation with participants. This transition brought both loss and opportunity. The loss of living voices was irreplaceable, but the establishment of historical distance might enable new forms of analysis less constrained by the emotional immediacy of living witnesses. The legacy of the Hitler Youth extends far beyond the individuals who belong to it. The organization demonstrated how totalitarian regimes exploit youth, how indoctrination functions, and how societies can mobilize young people for destructive purposes. It showed that education and idealism could be weaponized, that peer pressure and belonging could override moral judgment, and that ordinary children could commit or enable extraordinary crimes. These lessons remain relevant wherever young people face manipulation by extremist movements, authoritarian governments, or charismatic leaders. The final message from the generation of Hitler Youth members, delivered through their testimonies, memoirs, and educational participation, emphasized individual responsibility within collective catastrophe. They urged younger generations to think critically, resist absolutist ideologies, protect democratic institutions, and remember that good intentions do not excuse harmful actions. They warned that what happened in Germany could happen anywhere, and that preventing recurrence required constant vigilance. Whether future generations will heed these warnings from the past remains the unanswered question that will shape the future. The story of what happened to the Hitler Youth after World War II is ultimately a story about human capacity for both evil and growth, about how societies process collective guilt, and about the long shadow cast by totalitarian experience. It demonstrates that historical justice is complicated and incomplete, that individuals contain contradictions and change over time, and that some questions have no satisfying answers. As the last members of this generation pass from living memory to history, they leave behind a complex legacy that challenges simple narratives and demands continued engagement with difficult moral questions.